Just to introduce what's going to happen next. I said this at the beginning, but if you missed it, a lot of the material for today has come from Common Grace, which is an amazing community group. You can look them up, just Google Common Grace. They have many, many resources, and the Social Justice Team is using a lot of their resources today. They provided a sermon for today, but the Social Justice Team had another idea that I think will be even more insightful. That both Kate and Bill have had some experience in reconciliation, in learning from Indigenous people, and we're going to hear from them today. Sue Bolton, who's very much part of the Social Justice Team but is away today, just could not be involved. And so Sue has worked out a way of interviewing Bill and Kate whilst being overseas. I'm sure Bill and Sue are watching online. Hi. And so, Sue is going to interview Bill and Kate, and they're going to share some of their insights. So I'm going to invite them to come forward, take the chairs. I'm going to go back to my seat, and the tech team will work out how Sue can interview them. Is that enough introduction? Excellent.
That is, at some point during this conversation, I hope some of the things that I'll be talking about will be not that. Try again. There we go. Some of the things that I will be talking about, I hope, will be things along the lines of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. And to that end, I made an error in my acknowledgement, and I want to correct that before we start. I acknowledged the lands that we were on, but I didn't acknowledge the people. And I need to acknowledge the elders of this place, past and present, and extend that acknowledgement to all Aboriginal peoples joining with us today, but also the peoples that might be joining us online and the lands of the peoples that are joining us online as well. Anyway, over to Sue, I think.
And we'll have to catch up later. And I'm keen that you and Bill Good morning, Kate. Thank you so much for joining Bill and me in this conversation, as I know how busy you are. But I have some questions I'm longing to ask you, and I so look forward to hearing the answers, even though I can't be here this morning and we'll have to catch up later. And I'm keen that you and Bill and I can illustrate the changes that have occurred in Australian society and understanding over the years, especially between the generations that separate us. Kate, I suspect that your education in Indigenous matters, even at primary school, was very different from mine and Bill's, as was our understanding of Australian history that all three of us studied at university. When I look back on my childhood, I'm astonished at how little I learnt about Indigenous culture, even though my best friend, also called Sue, was of Aboriginal heritage, albeit adopted by a white couple. At school, Sue and I learnt that Aboriginal people were nomadic hunter-gatherers, good at throwing boomerangs and very little else. Bill, was your education any better? And Kate, what did you learn at school about Aboriginal people?
Well, I started school in 1945. I lived in Manly, so we did actually, I was aware that the name of our suburb, Manly, was because Governor Phillips thought that the Aboriginal people he saw there were very strong and manly, and that's where we got the name. We also knew that Governor Phillip had a spear thrown at him at Manly, and that Bennelong, a very important character in the early time, was kidnapped from Manly. But as far as being in school, what we learnt at school was practically nothing. I do remember that when we started being taught history in about third or fourth class, we learned about explorers and all their great deeds. And there are a couple of incidents from the explorer's story. One was John Oxley. He was going down the Murray River, and he had made some friendly contact at first with Indigenous people, and then at the confluence of the Murray and Darling River, he was confronted by, as they called it, 600 hostile natives. Now, these actually were Buckinjung people, and they were defending their country because they would have already heard what was happening further east with Wiradjuri and other people. But fortunately, the Indigenous people he'd made friends with came along at the nick of time and rescued them. The other story was of a figure, a man named Wiley, and he was an Aboriginal guide to the explorer Eyre, who got himself into strife trying to cross the Nullarbor. Not a great idea. And it was Wiley who was able to find water and food. So there are a couple of things that I learnt. But out of school, I was a curious child and interested in history and archaeology and all those sorts of things. Nearby where I lived, in French's Forest, there were some Indigenous rock carvings, so I was always interested in that. And there was one occasion when my mother took me on a holiday to the Blue Mountains, and we stayed in the Hydro Majestic. Now, behind the Hydro Majestic, there, or beside it, there was a museum run by a guy called Mel MacArthur. And it was full of what they used to call curios. He'd made this collection of Indigenous artefacts from all around the world. Incredible stuff. But among them were some Aboriginal skulls. My son Martin, who's written several books on this subject, has found out that Mel MacArthur was paying people to collect, actually do grave robbing and collect stuff. So that's some of the things I learned as a child.
I think what's interesting about that in some ways, Bill, is that some of the experiences and things that you learnt in your school and through your own curiosity is almost richer than what I was receiving at school, even though, my schooling started in 92, so a little bit after you started your schooling. We Aboriginal history and cultures was a big part of our curriculum, and we learnt about dreaming stories, and we learnt about life prior to colonisation, but generally what happened after you started learning about colonisation, and I suspect this is true for many of you listening today as well, once you started learning about colonisation, the experiences of Aboriginal people kind of dropped out of the picture for a while, and you were learning primarily about the establishment of the colonies here in Australia, and then you might pick up the experiences of Aboriginal people again in the 1960s when civil rights activism really gets going. And so a lot of what I was learning about in school was, well, there's this culture that existed before colonisation, and then they sort of just disappeared for a while and went really quiet, and nothing else was really happening. And then we start to see some attempts to kind of regain rights through the 1960s. it was certainly, I'm fortunate, I suppose, that the teachers that I had did try and do justice to that, but it is a product of the curriculum as it sort of existed back then. Two things that it's really apparent to me now, particularly in my role as a history teacher. So I'm doing the teaching now and making the choices about what students are learning in class as much as I can within the confines of the syllabus, is that a lot of what we were taught was quite flattening in the sense that we were taught that all Aboriginal people were the same effectively. Everyone had the same experiences. We would talk in the textbooks would talk about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples, but without that sense of diversity of culture across the country and diversity of voices. Certainly having Aboriginal perspectives and voices being integrated in what we're doing was not a priority. And so there was this tendency for us to walk away going, well, all Aboriginal people think like this, or all Aboriginal people had this particular experience. And it was pretty passive. There wasn't an understanding of the degree of agency, of strength or resilience shown by Aboriginal peoples throughout this long history that we have in this place. And that would be the second thing that I noticed in my education, was a strong emphasis on what I would describe these days as deficit discourse, and that is an emphasis on Aboriginal people, or the disparity or the difference in the experience between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, with an emphasis on the negative, the emphasis on the loss, and not that recognition of the value, the strength, and an understanding that throughout this whole process, Aboriginal people have continued to advocate for themselves. And you've mentioned a few, examples already. I mean, we didn't learn anything about the Frontier Wars that wasn't until something I sort of picked up on later in uni, and we wouldn't have described it as Frontier Wars, certainly at school. We might have learnt a bit about Pemulwuy, but that's kind of about it.
It is incidental, really.
Yes.
Just an incidental,
yes.
But it wasn't interpreted to us as anything else but these brave people sailing down and facing these dangers.
Yes, and then they faced, they'd face the might of the British, and then that was kind of it.
That's right. Yeah. Well, my brother, who was 7 years older than me, actually joined the Communist Party, and he used to bring home the Tribune, the communist newspaper, and I'd look at that. And the Communist Party in those days was one of the only organisations that actually was concerned about Aboriginal rights and justice. So I was a little bit aware. This was probably when I was about 12. This was happening. Yeah.
I think the last thing I'd say to this, and then we might throw back to Sue again, is that anyone who says that politics should be kept out of the classroom has clearly never looked at a history syllabus. I've only been teaching since 2013, but I've been teaching for long enough now that I've looked at 2 syllabus revisions, and both of those, the product that comes out of that is entirely a political document. That's the kind of thing that politicians are absolutely arguing about, what should be in there and what should our students be learning about and what should we be focusing on. And I think I just want to put it out there that these decisions about what we get taught in school are informed by these broader conversations, and there's certainly space for us to push back a bit there sometimes.
Over to Sue. Back to Sue.
Good morning, Kate. Thank you so much for joining Bill and me in this conversation, as I know how busy you are. As for me, I was 15 years old before I met any other Indigenous people apart from Sue. Holidaying in the Whitsundays with my family, I became friendly with 2 girls from Palm Island who were working on the island where we were staying. As the only teenager apart from my brother, they let me hang out with them whenever they were free. I didn't learn anything of their island culture, but they did teach me to do a fairly good hula dance. In the months between leaving school and starting university, I met Kath Walker's younger sister. Kath Walker was an activist and a respected poet who later preferred to be called by her Aboriginal name, Udru Nunakal. Studying arts at Sydney Uni, I became aware of Charles Perkins. He was a mature age student, a former footballer, who would go on to become the first Aboriginal graduate from any university in Australia. He would come into the union while I was having lunch with my friends. He was clearly a celebrity even then. I would have loved to have joined the Freedom Ride that he organised in 1965, but I was only 17, so not officially an adult, and my parents forbade it. Charles Perkins went on to become a highly visible public administrator and activist. His daughters Rachel and Hetty have had prominent careers in the arts and in the arts and film industry. I went to university to become an English and history teacher, but I soon became engrossed in Indonesian and Malayan studies, and with that, and a major in Asian history, I lost my Eurocentric mindset. That was a pivotal period for me. Bill and Kate, did you have any pivotal experiences like that in your early adulthood? And Bill and Kate, how has your Christian faith shaped your thinking about Indigenous affairs?
You go first.
Okay, pivotal experiences. Yeah, I can tell you three. First one was in 1957. I just finished the first year at uni, and I was hitchhiking to Brisbane with one of my friends. And on the way, we were picked up by a semi-trailer. In the semi-trailer, there was a white man driving and two Aboriginal men in the cab, and we rode on the tray. Not very safe, but anyway, we soon discovered why we'd been picked up, because we came across another semi-trailer on its side, and spilling on the in the ditch were about 20 tonnes of apples and pears in cases. So we and the Aboriginal men were given the task of transferring all this load onto the good trailer, and they'd first of all pulled the crippled one out. And so we drove on, and when we came to somewhere we could stop and have some food, the two drivers sat together and we sat with Aboriginal men, and I could see they weren't very happy with the money they'd been paid. On the way back, we came down the Pacific Highway, and we were stopped at Nambucca Heads, and we thought, well, we'll go to the movies, why not? And so we got there a bit late, and being cheapskates, we paid to go and sit downstairs. And when the lights went at interval, we found that we were the only two white people, and the rest of the audience was Aboriginal downstairs, and upstairs were all the white people. And I experienced Australian version of apartheid at that point. The second pivotal experience was really important. I did anthropology as one subject, and in 1958 we had lectures from a guy called Mervyn Meggitt, who had just completed doing field work in the Northern Territory with the Warlpiri people. And it was his lectures that opened my eyes to the interconnectedness of everything about Aboriginal culture. The land, the language, the kinship system, the social structure, the law, the government, their connection to country. And that sort of opened my eyes to my awareness, I suppose, to how important the Indigenous culture was to them and their connection to country. And the third experience was in 1960, when Ruth, my wife, and I went with other people on a Christian work camp, and we built a house for an Aboriginal family to live in Kempsey. Sue also did something similar, she told me. Looking back, I wonder whether that was such a great idea, to build a house where this family would be separated from the rest of their community. We thought it was a good thing to do. I'm not so sure. Kate.
Probably the most significant experience for me, or certainly the point that was the turning point for me, is something that some of you would have been aware of because you supported me in it many years ago, and that was being a part of the Uniting Church's About Face program. So it was this program that used to run, which effectively sent people often from metro parts of Australia. So the group that I went with had people from Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide. And actually I think we had some people from Brisbane as well, to effectively go on exchange with Aboriginal communities for a short period of time. That's the best way to describe it, really. Not going into community with anything to do other than to listen and to learn. And so I went with a group of people from Melbourne, including a Filipino refugee who was settling in Australia and wanting to learn more about First Nations cultures here. So it was quite a diverse group. And we went to spend some time with the Adyamatna family in Port Augusta in South Australia. And then we went from there to Oodnadatta and spent some time in community there. And through that experience of sitting with family, and we entered community at quite a difficult time. There was a lot of sorry business occurring, and so people were sitting in this and graciously invited us to come and participate in some of those protocols around sorry business, but also when we moved to Oodnadatta, half the town had left because they had this business to attend to, and so we were left in this incredibly hot town. We went in the middle of summer. It was 45 degrees plus every single day, and we were there with the old people and the kids. And we'd stay inside until about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Then everyone would be out on the streets, and you'd just be hanging around having a bit of a chat. For me, that was the first time I'd really had that significant time of learning from Aboriginal people and developing relationships with Aboriginal people. There was a young woman in Port Augusta called Rani. Her mother was an Adyamatna woman, her dad was an Indian man, and she was my age and doing so many of the same things that I was doing as well. And she and I became quite good mates, and realising both the fact that we were so similar in many ways and then had these vast different experiences. One that really struck with me was her telling me that whenever they needed to book a motel for an evening, they'd send their father in to book it, because if her mother went in to book it, they'd almost always be told that there was no room available to them. So I was profoundly affected by these stories, and as a result of that, I felt really compelled to take my love for history, my love for working with young people, and retrain as a Hizzy teacher. And so since that moment, I finished up as a youth worker here at the end of 2012 and returned to university to become what I thought was going to become a history teacher, but actually what I found is in my first school that I was placed in at Pittwater High School, they were looking for a teacher in Aboriginal Studies. They taught it as an accelerated course. The teacher who had set up the course but had not yet had the opportunity to teach it ended up getting a transfer, and they needed someone to step into that space. And so, as the fresh out of uni teacher, I got the tap on the shoulder, and I honestly haven't looked back. So I've been teaching Aboriginal Studies at the senior level, so in year 11 and 12. Since I started as a teacher, and that sort of alongside other subjects like society and culture and studies of religion, which are all really about trying to help young people understand that there is a big wide world out there and other perspectives and other experiences that they can learn from. That's beyond their own world, and so I feel profoundly privileged, particularly as a non-Aboriginal person, to be teaching Aboriginal studies. And here I would say, that there would be many Aboriginal people who'd be quite unhappy about having a non-Aboriginal teacher doing that. But if I don't, it doesn't get taught So here, again, we don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and I get in there and I have a good crack and I make mistakes and I apologise and then we have another go as best as we possibly can. And all of that sort of started with that moment in About Face. But really, it's these years of relationship that I've developed with my Aboriginal colleagues through the local AECG, our Aboriginal Education Consultative Group, through excursions, camps, all this sort of stuff that has shaped me. And just very quickly, I'll just sort of go to Sue's second question here, and then I'll pass it back to Bill. The question about how has my faith shaped my response to this, I suppose I would say it's actually a dialogue. Yes, my faith has shaped my response to this, but also my experience in this place has shaped my faith. When I first started, it was absolutely driven by justice and a strong sense of justice, and that is still true. But it was a strong sense of, probably similar to what you were describing, Bill, of I'm going to go over here to help, right? And thank goodness, I hope I've lost some of that arrogance of understanding that, hey, maybe there's a lot more for me to learn than there is to bring. There's an Aboriginal woman by the name of Dr. Lilla Watson who worked with a group of Queensland activists, and she's got this great quote that I think I use as a bit of my guiding light here, where she says, "If you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." And for me, that is really the heart of it. That my understanding of the gospel means that if I live in this country with this shared history, in a country that continues to have these structures where not everybody is treated equally, where one part of the body suffers, then all of us are suffering, and that's my own experience of suffering. But if we can celebrate and honour all parts of the body, then we all do better together.
For me, following Jesus has given me a passion for social justice, and that's something maybe I'd like to explore with you in more depth at a later time. But to look a little bit at the theology of reconciliation, actually the whole Bible is all about reconciliation. From the fall, which is described in chapter 2 of Genesis, through to Christ's death and resurrection, and Christ giving his life for us, God reaches out. God is the one who reaches out in all situations of reconciliation. So when we think about this, the Bible, the reconciliation really, what it really means, it involves a change of relationship, because we live in broken relationships, a broken relationship with God and a broken relationship between person to person and community to community. And so reconciliation, theologically, is about healing that broken relationship, and this is the work of God. Jesus himself was a reconciler. He broke down barriers between men and women, the poor and the rich, the powerful and the powerless, Jew and Gentile, Jew and Samaritan. And this, I think this quote from 2 Corinthians 5:19 sums up what it's the central theological statement of the New Testament in one way. God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, and that's a central theological statement. In Paul, in writing to the Gentiles at Ephesus, said that once they were considered outsiders by the Jews, now through Christ they are one, Jew and Gentile alike. And the story of Pentecost, which we looked at last week, shows the breaking down of barriers. And as Phil was saying last week, Pentecost gives us the language of communication. In 2 Corinthians 5:18, it says, "All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation." So Christians have the ministry of reconciliation. And so as followers of Jesus, we clearly have a mission to take the good news of God's love and reconciliation. Sue again.
Now I want to move on to our theme of reconciliation. As I hinted, my teaching career was mostly focused on Indonesian language and culture, and I didn't give too much thought to Australia and our Indigenous history. However, that changed in the year 2000 with the Oxfam International Youth Parliament that followed the Sydney Olympics. I was privileged to attend as interpreter for a young East Timorese man. And in the week-long workshop on cultural identity that he was involved in, I met a young Aboriginal woman facilitator. Her name was Alison Page. And she was keen to meet my young East Timorese friend, as East Timor had recently become independent. So I got to know her quite well, and I was struck by her desire to share Indigenous culture and let it take its rightful place in shaping a shared Australian identity. It led me on a journey to learn much more about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. And I've done that through reading, listening, viewing and travel. And I have loved seeing how Indigenous involvement in the arts, in education, in sport, etc., has grown and flourished. Alison herself has had an illustrious career in architecture, design, art and academia. And her work is still driven by her desire to share her culture and to seek reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Bill and Kate, what do you see as the obstacles to reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians? And what do you see as a contribution that we Christians can make?
I think the first thing I would need to say in relation to this question, as a non-Aboriginal person, that is, I can really only speak about the obstacles that I see from a non-Aboriginal perspective. But if we want to hear about that, the first place we need to go is listen to community and to hear from those voices. Consistently, self-determination is paramount, and if we're talking about what needs to happen between two people in this relationship, we actually need Aboriginal people to have their voice heard about what's needed. Having said that, from a non-Aboriginal perspective, what could other non-Aboriginal people be doing, or what do I see as the obstacles or barriers within my own experience? It's a lot of it comes down to lack of knowledge. One of the most infuriating things for me about the Voice referendum and the No campaign was the success of the slogan, "If you don't know, say no or vote no." And I find that deeply infuriating, because surely the answer should be, if you don't know, go find out. It is not that hard to find Aboriginal perspectives on a range of issues that are facing community today. It is hard because those voices are diverse. It is hard because not everybody thinks the same or says the same thing. But why would we ever expect that? It's not like we look at a group of Christians and go, well, you guys are all the same. You all think the same thing, believe the same thing. Why would we ever do that for the First Nations people here in Australia? And so I think that the greatest obstacle there really is around that lack of knowledge and a lack of curiosity and willingness to find out. So when Sue asks, as a Christian, what can we make here? I think, Bill, you've encapsulated it perfectly before in saying that we are custodians of a story that embodies reconciliation, and we can take that with us, right? We can learn from that, the model that God offers of consistently reaching out over and over again, and we can do that by trying to learn from each other. My mate Dave, who's an Aboriginal man from up Kempsey Way, will regularly tell me and my students that we've got two eyes, we've got two ears, and we've got one mouth. We look and we listen more than we speak. And I think that's kind of the attitude that I'd want to take here. So if I was going to give you one practical thing to take away from today, I'd say go read something from an Aboriginal perspective. Engage with the Common Grace stuff. Here in the Uniting Church, we have the Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress. We are in a covenantal relationship with this part of our church that is seeking to honour that particular relationship and to allow voice of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Christians within our church to have a say to offer their perspective on our church. I would be engaging with that sort of stuff, but also not necessarily from a Christian perspective, but seek out those Aboriginal voices and as many as you can.
Yeah, okay, obstacles. You mentioned the voice to Parliament, and I think it needs to be understood that the failure of the voice has done incredible harm to Indigenous people. They are grieving terribly over the failure of the voice referendum. Community ignorance, that's right. People need to be more knowledgeable. And if you want to be a little bit more better informed, I've set up a library outside, pop-up library out in the foyer. Please go and use it. Borrow some books, write the book name you've borrowed on the sheet that's there. Pick up one of these, which is a bookmark for Indigenous Literacy Foundation. Have a look at what they're doing, go to their website. Start doing some investigating yourselves if you need to know more things. You can subscribe to the Koori Mail, which is out. I've got a copy of it outside there. Have a look at that, browse through that while you're standing outside. I think we are not understanding that trauma is intergenerational. The impact of, for example, particularly the stolen generation, that goes on generation to generation, that trauma. And this is a fact not only here, but elsewhere in the United States and in Canada, where children were removed from their homes. Exactly the same sort of thing happened there, exactly the same sort of intergenerational trauma that really needs to be taken on board. So what we're seeing now in problems in Indigenous communities is partly the result, or often perhaps very much the result, of this intergenerational trauma. Truth-telling has to be happening, and we are avoiding that. Mick Dodson, I heard him speaking recently on the inaction on the Bringing Them Home report. I think only 5 of the 50 or so recommendations, and it's 29 years down the track, for goodness sake. And that Bring the Home report, the other person that chaired it was Ron Wilson, who was a High Court Justice and also had been the President of the Uniting Church. So this report, what's happened to it? What can Christians do? Well, I think understand that to follow Jesus is to have a hunger for social justice. And I think it's embedded in our faith and not an optional extra. We need to value Indigenous culture and history and what it can give to the whole of the Australian community. We need to be better informed and understand that improvements, and you're making this point, it's not a matter of what can we do for you. It's a question of that, are we able to walk together? That is what is important, walking together. And support Indigenous people by showing up at rallies and at cultural events. Subscribe to cultural events like Bangara Dance Festival, for example. And you can advocate, you can write to your local Member of Parliament and write to the particular members of ministers that are state and federal level. And please visit our pop-up library. I recently wrote a letter to the Prime Minister on the Travis Lovett walk for truth, which ended last Wednesday. And he received that petition, and I hope he'll act on it. So I wrote to him and say, please act on it. I sent her a copy of the letter to Nicolette Buller, our local member. Let your local member know what you think, because they represent us in the Parliament. These are the sorts of things that I think as Christians we can be doing.
Thank you. A bit to think about, and we might hand it back to the band.
Thank you.